if the controversy around the Passion of the Christ wasn't the real story? In a quiet moment on Joe Rogan's podcast, Mel Gibson started saying things he was never supposed to say.
It was a great movie, but it seemed like there was resistance to that movie. I thought was very strange. There was like Hollywood resistance to that movie. Like people didn't like that you were making it.
No.
The tone changed. Rogan went completely silent. Because what Gibson hinted at wasn't about filmmaking, it was about something deeper that most people completely missed. And once you see what was really embedded in this movie, you won't be able to unsee it. The story Hollywood buried. On January 9th, 2025, Mel Gibson appeared on episode 2254 of the Joe Rogan Experience, and what followed became one of the most talked about podcast conversations of the entire year. To understand what Gibson exposed in that conversation about the Passion of the Christ, you have to go back to the moment the entire project almost died before it could even be born. After winning the Academy Award for Best Picture and Best Director for Braveheart in 1996, Mel Gibson was sitting at the absolute highest point of his career. He could have walked into any studio in Hollywood and greenlit virtually any project he wanted. Instead, he walked in with a script about the last 12 hours of the life of Jesus Christ, written entirely in reconstructed Aramaic, Latin, and Hebrew. There were no major English-speaking stars, no conventional action sequences, and a subject matter so divisive that studios did not even want to be seen associated with it. 7 major studios refused it. 20th Century Fox, which had an existing first-look deal with Gibson's company Icon, issued a public statement saying it would absolutely not be involved. Columbia, MGM, Paramount, Universal, Disney, and Warner Brothers all passed. Gibson told Rogan that what he encountered was not just commercial caution, it was something far more pointed. He told Rogan directly that in Hollywood, Christianity is the one religion you are still allowed to disparage. The same community that championed other faiths on screen had a categorically different and hostile response to this particular story. Rogan did not push back on this at all. He simply agreed. Gibson refused to fold. He had financed Braveheart himself and understood exactly how to make a film without institutional permission. So he wrote a check for $30 million to cover production, then a second one for $15 million to cover marketing and distribution, bringing his total personal investment to $45 million of his own money. There was no studio input, no creative interference, and absolutely no safety net. He hired Professor William James Fulco of Loyola Marymount University to translate the script into Aramaic and Latin, and Fulco deliberately built in occasional pronunciation irregularities because the characters in the story would not all have spoken those languages as their native tongues. Every single choice was made without a single executive having any say whatsoever. Gibson explained to Rogan that the film was never conceived as a story about Jewish leaders or Roman soldiers. It was conceived as a film about personal responsibility. He told Rogan that the entire point was that we are all responsible for this, not a specific group from a specific century, but every single person watching. And then he revealed something that most interviewers had never gotten him to say clearly. In the crucifixion scene, the hands you see holding the hammer, driving the nails, are his own. Mel Gibson's hands. He put himself in the frame as the one responsible. He made himself the executioner on purpose. The dark place that made the film possible. Most people assumed Gibson made The Passion of the Christ from a position of deep faith and rock-solid certainty. But that is not what he told Rogan at all. He told Rogan that in the years before production, he had spent a long time trapped in what he called his animal brain, a constant state of fight or flight where he could not sleep and could not function. He went to a brain specialist named Dr. Daniel Amen, who injected a radioactive tracer into his bloodstream to photograph his brain activity. Dr. Amen opened the results file while Gibson was in the room, looked up from the images, and quietly asked him if he was all right. The film was not born from certainty. It was born from a man in genuine crisis who turned back to the story that had shaped him and decided to tell it with everything he had left. Gibson's Catholicism is not the mainstream institutional faith of most American Catholics. He is a traditionalist who rejects the reforms of the Second Vatican Council of the 1960s, including its move away from the ancient Latin Mass. He built a private chapel in Malibu called the Church of the Holy Family, which observes the traditional Latin Mass exclusively. His father, Hutton Gibson, was a publicly known Catholic traditionalist whose views on the council were controversial in their own right. That theological background shaped every single element of the film, its language choices, its visual sources, and above all, its refusal to soften any part of the story to accommodate a modern audience that might find it uncomfortable. Gibson told Rogan that the beauty of the faith, in his own words, is that even for your worst transgression, you can be forgiven and redeemed. He said he truly believes God sent his Son to ransom humanity from its fallen nature and provide a blueprint for how to live. He also acknowledged without any hesitation that he was by nature an alcoholic, that the years when he drifted from his faith were years when everything in his life moved in the wrong direction, and that the film was his desperate attempt to transmit through cinema what he could not transmit through language. You could always tune out a sermon, but you could not tune out what he put on that screen. What Jim Caviezel actually endured. When Gibson called Jim Caviezel to offer him the role, Caviezel pointed out that his initials were JC and that he was 33 years old. Gibson told him he was freaking him out and hung up the phone. Before Caviezel accepted, Gibson warned him directly, "You will never work in this town again." Caviezel accepted anyway. What followed was the most physically punishing performance in the history of American cinema, measured not in awards but in what it cost the man who delivered it. He dislocated his left shoulder carrying the cross, which weighed over 150 pounds. He was accidentally struck twice by a real whip during the scourging scene when the actor behind him missed the concealed post. And the second blow left a 14-inch scar across his back that he still carries today. He spent months nearly naked in the Italian winter, temperatures at 25 degrees Fahrenheit, winds at 30 knots which gave him hypothermia, a lung infection, and pneumonia. The prosthetic covering one eye to simulate swelling destroyed his depth perception and caused migraines for the duration of the shoot. He lost 45 pounds. Then came the lightning. On the very last shot of the entire film, Caviezel was struck. He described the 4 seconds before impact as a sudden, eerie silence. Then it was like both ears being slapped at once. He saw pink static. People around him began screaming. Producer Steve McAvity reported seeing smoke coming from Caviezel's ears. Assistant director John Michelini was struck seconds later. It was the second time Michelini had been struck on the same production. In 2023, Caviezel publicly confirmed something he had not said before. Following the lightning strike, he died briefly at the hospital and was revived. The filming also required 2 heart surgeries, including open heart surgery. Gibson's warning turned out to be accurate. Following a film that earned $612 million worldwide and became both the highest-grossing R-rated film and the highest-grossing independent film in cinema history, Caviezel found himself unable to get major roles in Hollywood. He was blackballed. His agents dropped him. His lawyer dropped him over a subsequent faith-based project. The man who carried the film that made more money than almost any independent production in history was effectively pushed out of the industry that had refused to make it and then watched it become a phenomenon. The conversions, the healings, and the sources nobody was supposed to know about. The Italian actor cast as Judas Iscariot walked onto that set as a self-described angry atheist. Luca Lionello walked off it as a Catholic. He made his first confession. He had his marriage sanctified in the church. He baptized his children. He has spoken about it publicly in multiple interviews across the years since. A Muslim crew member who played one of the guards in the beating sequences also converted before filming concluded, a detail Caviezel himself confirmed. Father John Bartonek, the legionary priest who served as theological consultant, described the set as one where everyone felt openly comfortable discussing faith in ways that simply do not happen on film productions. Maya Morgenstern, the Romanian Jewish actress who played Mary, was secretly pregnant during filming. She did not tell the production. A pregnant Jewish woman playing a Jewish mother watching her son die, surrounded by a story about life coming out of death, was a symmetry the crew only fully absorbed after it became known. Gibson also told Rogan about a young girl with severe epilepsy who was present during filming and went an entire month without a single seizure. Other reports of restored senses reached the production. Gibson did not present any of this as proof of miracles. He presented it as a pattern that those present could not account for through ordinary means, and he said it on the record. Here is the detail that most coverage of the film completely missed. The sequences that disturbed critics the most, the extended two-part scourging, the specific design of the crown of thorns, the number of falls on the Via Dolorosa, and the way individual characters respond in specific moments, were not drawn from the four Gospels. They were drawn from the private visions of Anne Catherine Emmerich, a 19th-century German mystic and stigmatist who dictated 50 chapters of detailed sensory description of the Passion, from what she described as mystical experiences. Gibson has confirmed this in multiple interviews. He also drew on the visions of Maria de Agreda, a 17th-century Spanish mystic. The film that critics accused of being anti-Semitic was actually built, scene by scene, on the private revelations of two dead Catholic women whose accounts the Vatican has never formally endorsed. That is what was buried inside the Passion of the Christ. The anti-Semitism controversy that nearly buried the film before release had a specific origin that Gibson addressed with Rogan. The Aramaic version of the line from Matthew 27, "His blood be upon our children and upon us," remains audible in the film. The English subtitle was removed from the release print. Scholar Geza Vermes confirmed publicly that the words are there in the Aramaic, only the translation was cut. Gibson told his brother he was initially going to remove it entirely, then kept it in. He told one interviewer that if he included it in the subtitles, people would come kill him. He kept it in the audio anyway. He has never fully explained why. The Shroud, the Apostles, and the argument that silenced Rogan. The exchange that landed hardest in the Rogan episode was not about filmmaking. It was about evidence. Gibson told Rogan he believes the Gospels are verifiable history, not mythology, and he came prepared to make the case. He pointed to Tacitus, the Roman historian, who confirmed the execution of Jesus under Pontius Pilate. He pointed to Josephus, the Jewish historian, whose references to Jesus have been confirmed as authentic by scholars across multiple disciplines. He pointed to the apostles, and he made the argument slowly and deliberately. Every one of those men except John chose death rather than deny what they claimed to have witnessed. People lie to save themselves. Nobody dies for something they know is not true. Rogan did not have an answer to that. Then Gibson brought up the Shroud of Turin. The 14-foot linen cloth preserved in Turin bears the image of a crucified man. And Gibson told Rogan that an archaeologist he knew personally, the same man who had translated the Passion script into Aramaic, had found marks on the shroud consistent with a Tiberius coin having been placed over the eyes. That was a documented first-century Jewish burial practice. The coin, if confirmed, would provide a historical dating mechanism placing the cloth in the 1st century. Rogan's research team pulled up 2 articles published within the preceding 6 months that reached opposite conclusions about the shroud's age. Gibson used that directly. The question is not settled. The 1988 carbon dating that dismissed it as medieval has been complicated by subsequent analysis showing the tested fibers came from a later repair patch, not from the original cloth. Gibson is not presenting the shroud as proof. He is presenting it as one specific, verifiable data point in a larger argument that the historical claims of Christianity have not been debunked, only ignored. That distinction matters on a podcast where Rogan has spent years pressing people on exactly that kind of intellectual sleight of hand. Gibson made the argument without hedging. He did not say he hoped it was true. He said he had looked at the evidence and found it compelling. For a man who had been called a religious fanatic by mainstream critics for over 2 decades, the precision with which he made that case in a non-religious context was the moment the conversation stopped being about a movie. $612 million against the unanimous advice of Hollywood. The Passion of the Christ opened on Ash, Wednesday, February 25, 2004. The New York Times had already predicted it would end Gibson's career. On opening day, the film earned $26 million, nearly the entire production budget, recovered in a single 24-hour period. By the end of its first week, it had crossed $125 million. By the end of the first month, it was past $200 million. The New York Times subsequently published a piece acknowledging that the film had revealed to the industry what had not been known to exist. The final worldwide gross was $612 million against a $30 million production budget. Gibson's distribution deal with Newmarket Films split gross profits 50-50. His share of the box office alone came to approximately $150 million. DVD and home video added another $75 million. When licensing, merchandise, and ongoing streaming revenue were included, Gibson's personal earnings from a film that every studio had refused have been estimated at between $400 and $475 million. It is the largest individual payday from a single film in the history of Hollywood. The film he financed with his own money, which every institution told him was uncommercial, is the most profitable independent production the industry has ever produced. Roger Ebert gave it 4 stars. He wrote that he had never understood the depth of the suffering in the gospel accounts until he watched this film, and he called it the most violent and intense film he had ever seen. He said that not as a criticism, but as a measure of what Gibson had accomplished. The studios that passed on it did not respond by commissioning more films like it. They responded by quietly developing lower-budget religious content designed to capture some of the audience Gibson had exposed, without the conviction or the risk. None of those projects came close. The audience had not wanted a religious film. They had wanted a film made by someone who actually believed what they were showing them. What Hollywood did after it was humiliated. The success did not reconcile Gibson with Hollywood. It embarrassed the studios, and embarrassment in that industry produces resentment rather than reflection. Gibson had not just beaten the odds. He had beaten the explicit professional judgment of every major institution in the business, using an audience they claimed to represent in a genre they had collectively declared dead. The pre-release controversy, orchestrated largely through early distribution of a leaked script to religious leaders who had not yet seen the finished film, had been designed to kill the project before it opened. It failed. And the people who ran it knew Gibson knew. The violence in the film became the focal point of the backlash. Gibson's answer to Rogan was the same one he had been giving for 20 years, but stripped of the diplomacy that public relations tends to attach to it. The violence was not there to shock. It was there to make the theological claim impossible to intellectualize. Christianity does not make the claim of redemption in abstract terms. It makes it in the specific language of physical suffering. Any portrayal that softened that suffering was, in Gibson's view, dishonest to what the story actually says. He made the film for an era that had become immune to comfortable religious imagery. The only register that could not be looked away from was the one he chose. Whether any individual viewer found that justified or excessive depended entirely on what they had already decided before they bought the ticket. While Gibson sat in the recording studio with Joe Rogan, his house in the Pacific Palisades was being consumed by the Los Angeles wildfires. His girlfriend and young son had evacuated safely. Surprisingly, Gibson found out during the session, but he kept talking and did not react. Rogan's team learned about it after the episode was released. That detail, a man talking about sacrifice and suffering and what it costs to create something that matters while his home burned, was not staged. It was just what happened. The sequel Gibson called an acid trip. Gibson has titled the sequel The Resurrection of Christ. He told Rogan the script is finished and that writing it with his brother and Randall Wallace, the screenwriter behind Braveheart, took over 7 years. When Rogan asked him to describe it, Gibson said an acid trip. He said he had never encountered anything quite like it in his career. Then he used the word ambitious in a way that made it sound less like promotional language and more like a genuine warning. He was not certain he could pull it off. That admission from a man who had already done the commercially impossible once was the thing that stopped Rogan mid-sentence. The film does not open at the empty tomb. It begins with the fall of the angels. It goes to hell, to the realm Gibson described using the Hebrew term Sheol, the underworld of the dead as understood in the tradition he was drawing from. It spans, in his own words, from the fall of the angels to the death of the last apostle. The resurrection story, told properly, requires understanding what it represents at a cosmic level, not just what happened on Easter morning. What it means relative to everything that preceded human history and everything that followed. Gibson told Rogan that is the story he has been trying to tell for 2 decades, and that the first film was always just the first half of it. Lionsgate confirmed in May 2025 that it will co-produce and distribute the film in North America. Sony Pictures, under the Columbia banner, will handle international distribution rights for the original. Jim Caviezel, the man who died during the first production and has 2 heart surgeries on his record for making it, will reprise the role of Jesus. De-aging visual effects will be used to maintain continuity between the 2 films. Gibson told Rogan he was aiming to begin principal photography in 2026 and acknowledged that the technical challenge of depicting spiritual realms, cosmic warfare, and a physical resurrection without being cheap or obvious was one he had been turning over for years and had not yet fully solved. However, Gibson said that he is ready to take on the challenge because what was buried inside the Passion of the Christ was not a secret about the film itself, but was a secret about what the film was actually doing to people. The acid trip does not exist to make money, though it probably will. It exists because Gibson decided 20+ years ago that he had something to say about what this story means, and he has not finished saying it yet. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.